Now, as I said, Alexander Hamilton was one of the foremost economic thinkers, and one of the things that he desperately wanted to create in this nation was to make us a manufacturing nation. Okay, we were at that point, as I've said previously, an almost exclusively agricultural nation. This was a country that, as colonies, Britain had never wanted us to actually be able to manufacture our own goods. As I've said before, our job was to provide the raw materials and then purchase the finished goods from England. But Hamilton wanted us to be a manufacturing nation, and one of the things he proposed was a national treasury. Now, we have the Department of the Treasury today, and we don't really think twice about it. We also have what's referred to as the Federal Reserve Bank, and again, it's something that not a lot of people put a lot of thought into. But this was kind of a radical idea when it was proposed. Hamilton wanted there to be a national treasury. He wanted it to be a private institution, a private business modeled on the Bank of England. Okay, this kind of falls back in again to the complaints or the accusations that he wasn't totally loyal, that he still harbored some kind of, love for England. But it was the idea, it was going to follow the model. And the idea was to have it as a private institution in which the federal government was a major stockholder. So it would be a private company, but the owner of the majority of the stock would be the government itself. And the reason for this was to circulate cash, because we needed to make sure that we did have some form of currency that we were using in the nation that actually had the, confidence of the people. So it would circulate cash. This would in turn stimulate business. It would also be used to store excess money. Okay, we could print money that was actually going to be worth something. So the idea was that this bank would provide for a variety of benefits for the new nation. Now, the problem was, as Jefferson put it, he argued it was unconstitutional. Now, there is a debate on this. There are two modes of thinking in regards to the Constitution. We'll talk about those in just a moment. But Jefferson argued that there was nothing in the Constitution that allowed for the creation of a bank, and therefore it was unconstitutional. Plus, he saw it simply as a tool for the rich to get richer. Jefferson wanted the United States to remain a predominantly agricultural nation. He wanted it to be a nation of small farmers, and he thought that was the best bet for the future. So he and Hamilton totally 100%, 180 degrees opposite of one another when it came to the future of the nation. Now, we'll look first at Hamilton's views. Okay, now we'll talk about the constitutionality or the unconstitutionality, depending on your point. Now, as for what Hamilton believed, okay, his theory was, and this is called a loose interpretation of the Constitution, if it is not forbidden in the Constitution, then it is permitted. Hamilton's view was, unless there is a statement within the Constitution itself saying that A, B, C, or D, whatever you want to say, in this case we'll say the creation of a national bank, if the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit the creation of a bank, then it is acceptable. Now, that's not just for this bank. That is on absolutely anything whatsoever. This is called a loose interpretation of the Constitution. It is the idea that anything can be done as long as it's not specifically prohibited. Okay. Now, there is a line in the Constitution that Hamilton is going to use. He said that a bank was, quote, necessary and proper. Now, this phrase, it's actually in the Constitution, and it's referred to as either the necessary and proper clause or sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. It basically says, gives Congress and the government the ability to do things that aren't spelled out in the Constitution. I'll give you an example. Okay, everything at that time we've talked about, coins were how you made money. Okay, so that is the responsibility of Congress. Their job is to mint the money. However, how can you make the coins unless you have a mint in order to actually create them? Well, there is nothing specifically in the Constitution that says it's all right to build a mint to make coins. But you can't make the coins without a mint. Therefore, a mint would be necessary in order for Congress to actually fulfill its duty of creating the currency. So this is, like I said, also called the Elastic Clause. Greatly expanded federal power. And the Elastic Clause has been used for a large number of things throughout the course of time. You will find that with this loose interpretation of the Constitution, there have been a number of things that are now considered constitutional that may or may not have been the original founders' intent. Best example would be the right to privacy. Collectively, we agree that there is a right to privacy. There's a constitutional right to privacy, even though there is no specified right to privacy within the Constitution itself. So again, this is what's known as a loose interpretation of the Constitution. It is the idea that you do have the authority to do those things necessary to carry out what you're supposed to be doing. And Hamilton saw the bank as one of those things, that it was absolutely necessary in order for the nation to survive, in order for us to have, some kind of actual working currency that the people actually trusted in. So that's Hamilton's views, okay? The idea is, again, it's not forbidden, it must be okay. Now, what about the other side of the coin? What is it that Jefferson thinks? His view is 100% the opposite. His theory is, if it is not specifically, permitted within the Constitution, if it does not say, yes, you can do, A, B, C, or D, then it means you cannot do it. If it's not permitted, if it's not, spelled out, then it is 100% forbidden. At least that is Jefferson's theory. His argument, bank should be a state-controlled item. There should be no national bank. The only banks that exist should be ones that are run by the individual states, okay? 10th Amendment says that powers not delegated in the Constitution are left to the states. So since it doesn't specify in the Constitution that you could do something like this, it instantly becomes a state issue. Jefferson is going to be a proponent of what's known as strict constructionism or strict interpretation. His theory is the Constitution should be interpreted literally. It only allows what it says are allowed. Now, these arguments, strict versus loose interpretation, they have gone on essentially since the start of the nation. And you will see every single time there is a presidential election, one of the big questions is about the Supreme Court, who will be nominated to the Supreme Court. And the reason for that is justices, just like everybody else, have their own interpretation of how all of this works. So you do have two very different belief systems here on how the Constitution should be read. Now, interesting thing that we'll talk about coming up in the not too far off future is the Louisiana Purchase, which there is nothing in the Constitution that would allow for that, and yet Jefferson went through and did it anyway. So it's one of those things where his, very, very closely held belief on the interpretation of the Constitution sometimes, I guess, was open to. Okay, so what was the end result? Hamilton won. Okay, Washington, not overly enthused, but did sign the bank measure into law. And we had the creation of what's known as the Bank of the United States, or the BUS. Okay, created by Congress in 1791. It is chartered for the next 20 years. So it comes into existence. Congress gets everything done. They send it to President Washington. He signs off on this, and voila, we have ourselves a national bank. Now, this is how it was supposed to work, okay? This is the way it was originally set up, okay? The bank itself, remember, this is prior to when we have Washington, D.C. as a federal capital. So the bank is going to be physically located in the city of Philadelphia. And into that, it's going to have a capital of $10 million. Now remember, we're looking at a national debt of $75 million. So $10 million is not a small amount. But this is being put in there so that way the bank will have some liquidity. The bank will be able to help keep the money supply, going and make it trustworthy, make it so that the people have confidence in the money in which they're using. It will help to get businesses going and things like that. And remember, we said that the federal government would be the major stockholder, or a major stockholder at least. That also means that shares of the bank, stock in the bank ownership, is open to the public. Now, it's just like today. You can go through and you can purchase stock in pretty much any corporation that is quote-unquote publicly traded. And that was the case here with the Bank of the U.S. In fact, stock was thrown open to public sale, and it did come as something of a surprise that you had a crowd of people started buying the stock, and quite literally, all the stock was gone within 2 hours. So there was a sincere feeling among investors that this was a good investment, that this was a good place to put their money. This was also going to help with that feeling that the government was going to survive and thrive and everything was going to work out well. So we had this fight over the bank, and this is not the last time we're going to talk about the bank. The bank will become an even bigger issue in the Jackson administration, about 30 years from this point in time. But it is one of those things that did help solidify the new government. Okay, the Bank of the U.S. came into existence, and we knew that it was going to be there for at least the next 20 years. The assumption was it would probably go beyond that, but nobody was 100% sure at that point, and you'll just have to wait to see what eventually happens.